right, welcome to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. This morning we will have a conversation again with Abdaljawad Omar. Very excited to have him back. We had him on, I guess it was last week. Was it last week? Yeah, I think so. To discuss his response to Adam Schatz's piece and some of his other, work and interventions. And one of the pieces that we started to have a conversation on just a little bit was one that wasn't out yet at the time, which was his response to Judith Butler's piece, The Compass of Mourning. And so we're going to talk today about this piece, Can the Palestinian Mourn? He also has a new one that just came out, Army and Arabs, Truth, Play, and Illusions in the West Bank, which we didn't prepare questions for, but maybe we'll talk a little bit about some of that as well. So yeah, excited to have you back, Abdaljawad. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Jared. I'm happy to be back.
Right on. Did I do a better? Oh, go ahead. I was saying, did I do a better job with your name this time?
Yeah, it's perfect.
All right, good.
I mean, there's in Arabic we say it's not Abdaljawad, but it's but that's like too tough to pronounce. So
Yeah. It'll take some time. I'll get there. Yeah. So yeah, thanks again for joining us again. Really enjoyed the first conversation. For folks that didn't catch it, it's on the YouTube page. We also put out slightly like edited and cleaned up audio version too on our podcast feed that you can check out. We're going to kind of pick up on some of the things we talked about in that discussion. I think we should start probably maybe just to say a little bit of what you're because I don't want to assume that everybody listened to that first conversation. Say a little bit of some of the pieces within Judith Butler's piece that you thought were necessary to respond to or to think about a little bit.
I mean, to me, when, I generally speaking, when I started like reading a lot of the responses coming out, on places like LRB, the London Review of Books or other places more broadly, some of these pieces stood out, specifically from people who are generally attuned to, Palestinian, to the Palestinian experience, like Judith Butler or even Adam Schatz, who know the realities, who visited as well. I think Judith Butler visited Palestine 3 times at least. She even gave a lecture in Birzeit, etc. So these responses in many ways provoked me to write responses, but also provoked me on a level that was kind of elementary. Like it wasn't really necessarily very intellectual at that moment, because I just like when I read them, I just felt there's something wrong, and almost immediately just became nauseated with some of these responses. And you can understand a lot of why people make these responses. I mean their positionality, Adam, or somebody like Judith, is different than yours, and of course that means that perhaps the responses will also be slightly different to how you perceive the world, as such, and how you interact with it, specifically through your lived experience. And with Adam, I think because I am more, generally speaking, in my writing, interested in the politics of things, and political, discourses. So I think his attempt to actually lay out a political rationale for the October 7th offensive maneuver within the Gaza envelope was more interesting to me than Judith's response, because Judith's response remained on this very humanistic, kind of universalistic level that still made me feel that I need to do something about. But I kind of like deferred it once I saw Adam's attempts or Schatz's attempts to actually lay out some sort of political argument or rationale, even though he morally condemns it and dismisses it, as we laid out the last time. So then I looked at Judith's response, and she centralizes this notion of mourning. And to me, it remained, as I said last time, a very strategically vague concept in terms of what the compass is actually supposed to tell us about, mourning itself as a means to transcend the colonial relationality, or is it mourning as something directed more towards, the global north, or the imperial center of people need to, hold both Palestinians and Israeli victims equally grievable, and therefore it's not necessarily directed towards, the Israeli-Palestinian context itself. So it remains strategically vague to me, because the piece actually moves from that global north imperial center positionality towards the actual relation on the ground between Palestinians and Israelis in a way that confuses the reader. I don't think you can really grasp what she's trying. Is she trying to offer mourning as a way out of conflict and violence and war, or is she offering mourning simply for the distant, empathetic eye that looks upon the conflict? So that remains to me confused, and that's why for instance, I wasn't really responding, exactly to her article per se, like to the
Right.
whole of the article. Yeah, I don't know. You wanted to intervene, I thought, or
No, I think that's right. I think you're not you kind of set up and respond to a few points, and then it's really your own argument that you're kind of laying out around mourning.
yeah, I mean, because I couldn't like actually, I think it's also, a smart strategy when you like kind of like include everything but not be clear about anything. Like when Judith is writing such a piece, it's kind of like a raw response to events, but at the same time she's like angering everybody, but at the same time not angering anybody enough. Like it's a it's a it's a it's a smart raw response. And I think, I don't know, like, there was that bit about, what the Harvard SJP issued, blaming, the Israeli state for all violence, that she condemned because she holds Palestinians also responsible for their actions, and they shouldn't be treated otherwise. But other than that kind of like argument, you can't just simply touch without feeling a sense that it says everything and nothing at the same time, kind of.
Hmm.
It contextualizes, yet it condemns morally. It talks about mourning in the global from an empathetic distance, but also talks about it within the context of Israel Palestine. It navigates all these elements. But I think it was interesting to me to talk about, like, Palestinian lived experience of, melancholy and mourning, and how that is part of, like, the temporal spatial terrain that we live in, and why Palestinians are incapable, perhaps, or also reject, this process of mourning to commence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's get into that a little bit. So, you're kind of in dialogue with her piece, as we kind of said. You kind of quickly address some of her arguments in the beginning, and then move into your own reflection. And we talked about a couple elements of this last time, as you just discussed, like this idea that Palestinians are denied mourning, as you say, sort of they don't have the space and time for it, basically, and they also refuse it. There's a refusal as well. So you make a number of interesting points, I think, along the way in the piece. One is that there's this point you bring up of looking at Derrida's work, and I guess one of the things that he lays out that mourning is supposed to do is put us in touch with our own mortality and sort of teach us a sense of humility. And so let's get into that a little bit. I don't want to put words in your mouth, and you can kind of lay this out. Folks should also read the piece. I'm not going to sort of replicate the whole thing as I ask the questions, but you seem to find this process to be kind of both redundant, like, as in, there's a humility process that is just inherent to sort of colonialism and Palestinians under that, and then also impossible in some ways because of the colonial condition and the situation. So yeah, talk a little bit about some of those dynamics.
Yeah, I mean, so I mean, the interesting, part of Butler's piece is that she actually says Palestinians are denied the right to mourn. So she's aware that there's a problem with mourning among Palestinians. So mourning in like, in Freudian psychoanalysis, or in, it assumes that you can commence a process of grief around an object of loss. It doesn't mean a person, but it could be an idea, an ideal, etc., where you detach, and at some point you can successfully mourn by detaching from that object of loss. So for Freud, mourning can be successful, can be, a process that ends up with the person grieving for some time, in his chronal refuge, as I call it, and then it reaches a point where you can successfully detach from from that thing that you lost, whether it's a person, ideal, etc. Now, that's one bit of the influences that also are in, generally speaking, Butler's take on mourning, that Freudian element. But also there's a Derridian side to it, which is that, mourning is a never completed, it's a never finishing, or never ends. It's always a process that we also, when we lose someone or we lose an ideal, we kind of lose a bit of ourselves as well. We lose the world that this thing or this someone opened for us. A friend who dies is also an end to a world that we knew, and that the dead kind of speak to us all the time. But also for Derrida, at some point, it's also, you can mourn your own death before your actual death. And there's the concept of chase comes in at some point as being, central in Derridian work. Now, I didn't go into all of this because I don't think like that is so pertinent or, important, at least in terms of how we speak about mourning. But at least for me, what is interesting is that because Butler does kind of recognize that there's no right to mourning, the question becomes is, can Palestinians really mourn? Can Palestinians, in fact, detach completely from the object of loss, even when they attempt to detach from that object of loss, whether it's Palestine as a horizon of possibility, whether it's a person that they lose, etc. And I think that in many ways, because when you live in a colonial condition, your lived experience is already a horizon of what I called revulsion. And we can talk about that more. And also loss. I mean, it's not just a catastrophe that happened, it's also a catastrophe that is ongoing. In fact, Ilyas Khouri, a Lebanese writer, literary figure as well, who was part of the Palestinian national movement, he calls the Palestinian situation an ongoing Nakba, an ongoing process of catastrophe. He temporalizes not as an event that happened, for instance, in 1948, but this continuous process, and it ties well with all like the settler colonial, if you want, literature, which talks about the settlers' intention to eliminate the native, the settlers' intention to eradicate and replace the native, etc. So in many ways, you live in this horizon of loss. It's a never-ending process. The loss of land, the confinement in space, the loss of friends, the loss of family members, and loss is so recurrent. We also, another Palestinian writer called Ismail Nashif, that he calls it that we live in this kind of zone of recurring loss. And it's a never-ending process that is never never gives you a break, a ceasefire, if you want, that you can actually go into your house, your dwelling, and do this kind of rites of mourning. So in fact, in many ways, the intensity of death, the intensity of loss, its appearance as the world around you. And this is what's different, for instance, between Palestinian mourning and, for instance, when Israelis are killed and then they mourn, is that they don't live in that horizon of a space-time where, loss, revulsion exists. It's a different space. It's a different space-time in which they can perhaps perform mourning even when they're victims of Palestinian violence, for instance. It's that it's always interrupted, that you don't have that chronology, because it's always, there's somebody who died, or there's a lost idea, but there's also this, somebody who's gonna die in the future, and it's always yet to come. And I think, many Palestinians, when we talk about our families, part of our, like, just simple experience with our mothers, when my mother hears an ambulance, for instance, like we have an ambulance here, she always calls me like almost immediately or sends me a message like, "Are you okay?" There's always that kind of like anxiety that of something could have happened, because we're already used to being not only in this space where we're vulnerable and precarious, where families prepare for themselves all the time for the possibility of the death of their children, death of their friends. We always live in that space. So in very ways, while mourning also teaches us, as Derrida says, and also perhaps Freud also mentions, humility in the face of death. You recognize your own finitude. Death is not only an idea that could happen in the future, but it's an actuality that accompanies you. The moment you lose somebody close to you, an intimate figure in your life, you're reminded that of your own death at that moment. And perhaps your sense of autonomy, your sense of narcissism, your sense of infinity, or immortality ends with that moment. Is that when you're actually born in the context of this horizon of loss and revulsion, the colonial condition, you're already precarious. You understand that. You already know that you're dependent on others, because you're dependent on others whether they kill you or not. I mean, in many ways, we kind of hold the sniper, the sniper's gaze in our very internal being. We're always walking in this world, thrown into this world, knowing that we might be at any moment killed, or knowing that we might be in any moment arrested, or we might be in any moment, even discussions, even funny discussions, even our sense of humor is all around that, who they're gonna take first, or who they're gonna kill first, or I haven't done anything to deserve being killed. So in many ways, I mean, you're already in your moment of birth, already propelled or thrown into a world that teaches you all the time that you are dependent, that your life doesn't matter, that you're completely expendable, that you rely on the other, whether he kills you or not, whether he arrests you or not, and whether he I don't know, throws you out of Palestine or not. So I mean, I don't think, and this is one of my points, is that for us, I don't think that we need to learn humility as much as we already live in this space of humiliation, and
Hmm.
that is part of the colonial experience. And therefore, I think in many ways, we cannot commence the process of mourning because we're precarious. Yet it's not only the death of somebody close that teaches me that I'm expendable, etc. So that's part of the intervention, the interruption of a colonial refuge, where we can feel like we can do the rites of mourning, but also existing in this space already teaches you precarity and humility, and perhaps also with a big dosage of humiliation as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Before we go further, maybe say a little bit about what you mean by the horizon of revulsion.
Yeah, I'll tell you where I came up with that. It's actually part of my experience in this world, in my short time on this world, or long time, I don't know. um, I was once arrested by the Israeli army. They took me from my home. It was a short arrest. It wasn't like anything significant. But when they cuffed me and they blindfolded me, and then put me in the Jeep, the Israeli vehicle that takes you to like your, outside of Ramallah. Um, I was placed in this crouching position within the Jeep. I couldn't sit. I couldn't lie on the, even the Jeep's, walls. And, because of the movement of the Jeep, you're always moving with it. So you have soldiers around them. And whenever you touch a soldier, what the soldier does is that, they kind of like revolted, like because something profane just touched them. So they make you feel untouchable, like you, as if you're a dirty thing. And sometimes if you touch them, you become also caught in like, that wasn't necessarily my experience, but other friends have gone through this experience, or people I know. If you touch them, they start beating you. So you cannot but touch them. And at the same time, touching them means that, they start kicking you around. That was not my experience, but it was the experience of other people. And it's a lot of experience of people also within Israeli prisons. where they feel this sense of the other looking at them with complete revulsion, as something not to be touched, as something to be distanced, as as to be completely dirty, uh, outside of the ability of um, to look at to look you in the face and to see the human within you. And so they turn you into this kind of profane object. And I think that's the only case that's necessary. I'm sorry, there's a motorbike. That's the only place, to be honest. I mean you need to be able to kill at will, and to also let live if you want. You also need that kind of gaze of revulsion, this infinite gaze that looks upon you with revulsion, with a sense of, dehumanization and all that. But it's different when you experience it in terms of how people look at you, or how they feel your touch, even if that touch was forced upon you. Like, it's not necessarily that I wanted to touch a soldier, but that's the point. So you live within that horizon. You live in a horizon where the other doesn't want you, and looks upon you with this form of revulsion, and looks upon you as an object, a profane object, to be avoided, or to be demolished and destroyed. So for me, that is the lived experience of living under military occupation, whether it's being in prison, or in moving through checkpoints, or whatever lived experience that brings us into this face-to-face encounter with Israeli soldiers. It doesn't mean that every time every Israeli soldier acts that way. I'm not saying that soldiers are always viewing you with this kind of disgust, but I think the whole system is built for that disgust, for that revulsion to be sustained and to be maintained, so that that soldier can also kill you at will, without feeling any sense of let's say guilt or pain. I mean, I'm sure that at some level subconsciously that still impacts them, but it's not in a very direct conscious level, at least. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's, I mean, awful, and also I think powerful how you share that. So there are reflections in the piece that you pull out from Palestinian literature and poetry. I appreciated this part. One from Ibrahim Nasrallah's novel Gaza Weddings, and then Mahmoud Darwish's State of Siege. Maybe you could share just a little bit of what you're taking from those pieces, and kind of how they relate to the thesis that you're working on in the piece around mourning.
Yeah, I mean, look, Palestinian literature is a catastrophe literature. No, it deals with the Nakba, and it comes out of a catastrophe, as Nakba means catastrophe in kind of like the most immediate translation to English. So it's a catastrophe literature. In many of ways, it operates within this horizon again of revulsion, loss, of negation, erasure. And it attempts to at least speak to that. It attempts to turn it into an intelligible form, either through poetry, or either through literature. And these are two different modes of articulation. I don't want to speak about them, but I think for me, what is central in Ibrahim's Nasrallah's take, and then Darwish's take, is that they kind of are contradictory. Ibrahim Nasrallah talks about ululations. He talks about how Palestinians refuse to cry in their funerals, of how they do this ululation. The mother would like celebrate the son's martyrdom, and he talks about it as as a ululation of defiance, because it's sustained through this internalized gaze of the Israeli looking upon the funeral, and denying him the satisfaction of being defeated in the midst of loss, in the midst of losing a person or a friend, or a son in this case. So he talks about the funeral as the place where Palestinians attempt to kind of defy still Israel's or the Israeli gaze that is thrown upon them and casted upon them, by showing pride, by showing, a celebration and martyrdom of death. And this is actually, it's somewhat culturalized, and in many Western takes, they say, Palestinians are, are a cult of death, or they celebrate death. And while Mahmoud Darwish is actually saying something opposite, is that don't believe the relations, believe the mother and the father when they're sitting alone at home after everybody has deserted the funeral, and they're crying at their son's, death. And to me, these are like two experiences that coexist in the context of Palestine, that we infinitely cry at those who we lost in silence in many ways, and at the same time we tend to attempt to reject and defy the loss of loved ones and intimate people around us that are killed by Israelis, because we see in that at least public moment of grief, a moment also to assert defiance, sumud, steadfastness, and the ability to continue building the will to resist and perhaps produce the next martyr. And what I mean that it's not only that we produce the next martyr, but that we're willing to tolerate still yet another martyr to come. So that is part of like the Palestinian experience. And I think also Brahim Nasrallah touching upon them in a sense that he also tells us at some point we will just cry without necessarily having, the need or to be defiant, and we will not forgive them that we had to like pretend for so long to be defiant or to celebrate the death of loved ones in this kind of in this sense that I just posited. But also in another way, Mahmoud Darwish at another historical moment, he Mahmoud, I had Mahmoud Darwish went through this kind of process of tragedizing the Palestinian struggle, specifically because he was a poet that was accompanying, the PLO in its, transformation from, a movement for liberation towards the Oslo peace process, etc. So he kind of like memorialized the PLO through this tragic sensibility. And then, so he offers us also in a way that don't believe, that I didn't comment on that in the piece, but he's saying, don't believe the relations, believe, the intimacy of the dwelling where, the mother and the father seeing their martyr son's picture on the wall or holding them will cry, because he was trying at this moment in the in the 2000s and 1990s to also like kind of talk about loss in a way that is not necessarily liberatory, not necessarily leading to a renewal of the struggle, and in a tragic cathartic sense where we kind of move from the possibility of Palestine to this mode that, somewhere else I wrote in Arabic, to this kind of like after Palestine, trying to search for something, a new idea, a new kind of recognition. And it actually touches upon the last part, or not the last part, but one of the pieces is that there's like two forms of melancholization processes happening, or two melancholies, occurring at the same time for the Palestinian subject within this horizon of loss and revulsion. One is, and it's built in Nouri Zghana's, I think, introductory book called Melancholy Acts. And I think, I shared that with Nouri. And it comes also, Nouri mentions Hussein Mroueh. Hussein Mroueh is a Lebanese intellectual and writer as well. And he writes, I think around the 80s, I'm not sure, a short article that talks about, two forms of sadness, or two forms of, if you want, melancholy, which is one that kills you and one that sustains you as a fighter. So there's kind of like these two sensibilities, if you want, to the colonial experience and what it produces in terms of melancholization. One that sustains you as a fighter, that produces you as a fighter, and the other one is not, it actually kills you, And so what I'm arguing in at least the piece, that in generally speaking, Palestinians, even when they kind of reject or they fall, in this mode of perhaps falling in love with loss itself, that you don't want things to change. You're melancholic. You feel like this disposition, this mood where you don't want to change. You sustain Palestine in this kind of shattered spectral sense. something like, I think, the Palestinian Authority right now in the West Bank, no, that it's, it holds Palestine somewhere, but at the same time, and it uses it and exploits it, of course, to still do security cooperation, etc. But it holds Palestine somewhere while betraying Palestine and not willing to actually change the status quo or join the fight with what's happening in Gaza. No, so there's that kind of like investment. You become invested in sustaining loss itself. No, that's part of the melancholy that kills you. It kills your ability to be proactive, active, to generate the will, and you in fact you can actually build muscle around it, as the PA does, that you sustain, that you protect against any kind of change to the status quo. I know, and the second part is, no, there's a melancholy disposition that leads the colonial subject towards defiance, turning grief, as Nurigana says, into grievance. Turning grief into an attempt, this shattered sense of loss in this melancholic moment, this melancholic disposition, this melancholisation as a process, means that you're trying to retain what you lost. You keep it shattered, but you're attempting to retain it. And that for me is where resistance also in a psychoaffective level actually also operates, in a sense that it attempts exactly to retain that is what is lost, but it still sustains that what is lost as a melancholic disposition. So in literature you have that. Ghassan Kanafani has that, because Ghassan Kanafani's, for instance, short stories, I didn't mention him in the piece, or novellas, they're all about closing the space for the Palestinians. Like he's kind of pessimistic in many ways. He builds this space of loss. He builds the hard choices that Palestinians have. He talks about the will to change that, but it's always it's small. I mean, in one of in the series of his short stories, there's always a story that doesn't have, he never offers us the bodies of those who are killed or dying. So there's, like, for instance, a bird that is caged, and even if you put it in a larger cage, it's still in this process of dying, but we never actually see the bird dead. There's no actual death. It's the same thing with his Men in the Sun novella, where we don't see those in the tank. I don't know, maybe people are not familiar with his literature, and you should introduce it more, but yeah,
I think they're getting more familiar. I mean, it's actually interesting. There's, in the last, I would say, 3 or 4 years, there's been more of an effort to publish his work. I mean, Louis Alday, again,
yeah,
with the translation of On Zionist Literature, but also 1804 Books recently in the US put out a collection, I think, of his political writings. So it's interesting, because I think the short stories, the fiction, actually has been around longer in English translation, but some people may be less familiar with it because they've more encountered some of his more political writings. Not that his fiction is not political, but nonfiction writings, I guess.
yeah. I mean, he has a lot of political writings as well, and he has a lot of and he was a political person and part of the political bureau of the PFLP, the Palestinian Front for the Liberation of the Palestine. But he was also known more as a literary figure, and he wrote, of course, short stories and novellas that are fast. And again, I think Palestinian literature, we can all group it in this kind of like catastrophic genre. It deals with catastrophe, it deals with this horizon of loss, it deals with opening the space to hope. And this is what I was trying to at least hint about with Ghassan, is that Ghassan always leaves an opening. He never finalizes death. He never finalizes his protagonist's death in a way that is complete, in a way that you see the body, or he describes the body. There's somebody who drowns, but that somebody who drowns remains kind of somebody that could survive. I mean, it's a figure that is left. The story never ends, and death is never complete in Ghassan's literature, no matter the stories. I mean, that is the disposition in his work. And I think this is exactly where resistance operates. It operates on that limit. It operates on that limit that you live within this horizon of finitude, death, of the erasure of the Palestinian subjectivity. And although paradoxically, also Palestinian is also a defensive form of nationalism in the first place, but at the same time, you conjure up the ability and the hope of resistance in this very narrow space for it to not finish or complete the act of death. So in that sense, what it means is that to completely shatter the possibility of Palestine. And nobody, I mean, no Palestinian writer has ever completely shattered. I mean, Mahmoud Darwish and others, they attempt to search for this kind of notion of after Palestine, after the heroic tragedy of the PLO moving from the hero into this kind of like the Oslo process and the fall of the heroic character or protagonist. He starts searching for these kind of motifs, Darwish, and searches for some notion of after Palestine, what comes after Palestine, or the notion of Palestine when Palestine have become impossible. Like that's the centrality of it, and that's why he's asking us for us to only believe the parents when they're crying at the children in the privacy of their dwelling, not highlighting the public, defiance of the ululations that surround the, Palestinians attempting to defy that loss and the feeling of pain for that loss through defiance of the Israeli. And I give some examples also from the war of Gaza, like Wa'il al-Dahdur, a journalist who's on Al Jazeera, and lost a lot of members of his family, including his son, I think Adam, and no, Adam is his grandson, Sham, and I think Ahmad, and he loses a lot of members of his family, but he decides, despite that, to still continue doing his job, because he understood at that moment that he also represents kind of a collective voice, of what is happening to Gaza, and for him to kind of withdraw into this coronal refuge where he does the rites of mourning would satisfy perhaps the Israeli gaze, would satisfy that withdrawal. So he insists on defying, he insists on giving people hope through this kind of persevering and insistence on still being the journalist and trying to report on what's going on in the Gaza Strip. So I mean, that's just part of the examples that you see in many cases, I mean, at least empirically, if you want, of what we're talking about.
Yeah, right on. So say a little bit more to you of how this enters into the calculus of resistance. I mean, you've talked about kind of, and elsewhere, I remember when you talk, one of your pieces where you talk about kind of some of the kernels of resistance in the West Bank in the last year or so. You talked about basically a generation that did not fear death yet, and had not been made to fear death too. I think was part of the point that you're making, and and of course you're also talking about living within this horizon of revulsion and loss, and so how do you think that how does this interact with the resistance?
Well, it acts in many ways. And the first way I was just trying to point out is that all resistance is still persists within this kind of horizon. It's melancholic, but its melancholic disposition is to attempt to retain that which was lost. To take this spectral shattered, for instance, Palestine as an ideal or notion, and to try to retain it in some way. That is part of it. That's part of it. But I think, and I think this is not a Palestinian, necessarily an experience, and it's shared by many people, whether it's in like, the radical Black tradition, for instance, or in other places across the globe, that in the context of colonialism, only an acceptance of your own death and the possibility of death can produce you as a freedom fighter, as somebody who would fight for freedom, can actually produce the space of freedom itself. A Revolutionary Suicide, I think, for Huey Newton, if I'm not wrong, the book, I forgot, it talks exactly about that. And it talks about, reactionary forms of suicide and revolutionary suicide. And that is part of the experience. I mean in the West Bank, for instance, these self-defense zones that are now coming a lot of intense pressure, young men in Palestine at this particular historical conjuncture, attempting to play on the limits of accepting death on the one hand, and at the same time trying to temporally defer it. So that's why we get these zones in the first place, in a sense that they're invested in the immediate experience, accepting the probability of them dying by the war machine that Israel has, but at the same time playing this kind of catch me if you can game with the Israeli military and intelligence, and attempting to temporarily stretch the time from when they accepted the possibility of death and the time where the actuality of death occurs. And that's the only reason why you could have, for instance, a Jenin refugee camp brigade that attempts to liberate an area and create this kind of sovereign spaces, at least sovereign in this immediate sense of the word sovereign, in not being, completely under the power of somebody else, because it has that power of accepting its own death. And I think for many Palestinian fighters who embark on, fighting, that is one of the conditionalities of fighting, is that you're a doomed man. You're gonna go to prison, or you're gonna end up, as a martyr, and that is the only possibility. That's the only possibility for the rise of the martyr. Interestingly enough, in many of the cases that we talk about, there's also recorded conversations in Arabic between intelligence officers from the Israeli Shabak, or the Israeli internal intelligence, that deals with us Palestinians and know everything about us, and etc. And some of these fighters, so they're recorded, the fighters themselves record them, and they sometimes publish them, and it's always the intelligence officers spewing threats: "We're gonna kill you, come, surrender, we'll find you, you don't know who you're messing with," etc. And whenever he finds, like in the case of the martyr Muhammad Dakhil, 2 years ago in Nablus, this officer is talking to him, and he says to him, "Look, I'm not afraid to die. Don't threaten me with the thing that I'm not afraid of happening." And that was the moment that this kind of movement, this art movement, was just starting. So for the intelligence officers, he was kind of like he lost his mind. He lost his mind. He starts screaming in the phone, "I'm gonna drink your blood. I'm gonna come, and I'm gonna do what and kill you," and he starts going into this kind of the intelligence officers reaches his moment of madness, if you want, this hysteric moment. And Muhammad is very calm. He's not actually reacting. He's like, "Okay, do whatever you want, do what you have to do." That's what he tells them. But for me, I'm not afraid of dying. And I think for many Palestinians, resistance is about that kind of acceptance. It's about mourning yourself as an individual to produce that resistance subjectivity, if you want. It's about mourning yourself before your actual death and accepting that possibility of death, and still insistent, in this case at least, unlike other, if you want, articulation of also resistance, like forms of martyrdom operations that happened in the 2000 to 2005, the human bomb element, or stuff like that. In this case, no. It attempts to stretch the time between the moment you declare yourself a resistant fighter and the time that your actual death, or you meet your actual death, and you sustain it through this kind of give and take, and through an ability, or at least an attempt, to preserve the capacity to resist. So that's also part of the equation for how resistance subjectivities arise, and why also they're engulfed with religious discourses, although they don't necessarily mean that these individuals are necessarily Islamist in like a political ideological sense, in a sense of having a position on the character of the state, or its or a position on how the state should be run. In terms of, it doesn't mean that there's a political, connotation, but it means that also religion, at least in this context, provides, an internal security, provides people with the power to sacrifice, provides people with kind of like a messianic belief that this violence also, has a continuity in after that. But I think that part of the cultural mistake that was done in the West is to try to attribute this kind of religious reward as the incentive for people to undergo this sacrificial, thing. And I think that misses the point. I think that comes afterwards. That comes in the moment that you accept your own death. The question of death within a society that is, as Palestinian society, also in many ways religious, or has religious elements in it, and where the discourse of religion can play a role in making death intelligible and meaningful, then religion comes in to provide a sense of security and a sense of sensibility. So that also deals with the martyr, or what in Arabic we call the istishhadi, not the shaheed. So the istishhadi is the one seeking martyrdom, not the one who is in fact a martyr already. So these discourses have always been part of, at least, Palestinian life, or the Fida'i in the context of the PLO experience in Lebanon and Jordan and other places. All these modalities of, if you want, of sacrifice and death. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's what you're saying there is really important, because I mean, this is like something that is so consistent also across like so many liberation struggles, resistance struggles. I mean, I mentioned to you before that I had written a piece about black abolitionist struggle during slavery period in the United States, and like it was an examination of spirituality within these struggles. And like um the misunderstanding of people a lot of times think is because people use um like Christian references or iconography, that like all of the spirituality that is at play is Christian, when actually it's very syncretic. It usually includes multiple elements of various African religions as well, including Islam, actually, because Islam was in West Africa at the time that many people were enslaved there. But um the this this reckoning with death, this acceptance of it as a possibility, also things like prayers of protection, or you know these are all elements that uh seem very important across, whether we're talking about Haiti and the Haitian Revolution, or whether you're talking about Nat Turner or Denmark Vesey, et cetera, et cetera. Like there's all these examples of um, these rituals, these rites, these understandings that are all related with accepting mortality on some level, and also certainly a connection to spiritual, to the immortal, to life after death. But you know, I think that it is a major mistake in the West, especially like on the left. We have this fetishization of secularity, and a lot of us are more or less agnostic or atheists, like in terms of our own religious backgrounds. But there's such an important aspect to spirituality and religion, and resistance, that I think that if we get too um I don't know, whatever it is, too dogmatic, I guess, in our kind of agnostic or atheistic views, um we miss the importance of that, and why, also misunderstanding why it works, why it gives people a capacity to resist that perhaps isn't available if folks just believe that there's nothing that happens after their resistance, and maybe there's certain secular descriptions. I think it's maybe I'd have to go and look more, but I think maybe Che Guevara talks a little bit about, um, just the idea of you can have a secular idea of sacrifice, a secular idea of developing history and what meaning of your sacrifice is towards your cause and things like that. So those are possible other registers of the same thing, but nonetheless, you still have to kind of come to grips with this idea of that your life has to be potentially sacrificed in this struggle. Similar to like what you were talking about with Huey P. Newton. I mean, Huey did approach it from a kind of secular perspective himself. Although I think his father was a minister. So, it was an interesting dynamic there that way. Yeah. Let's go to the piece you talk about in this about Zionist grief. So we talked about this just a little bit last time, or related to this idea of, that there's this sense of Israeli invincibility, this idea of the iron wall or the iron wall. And also there's kind of a paranoid view or a paranoia that comes with this. And one of the things that we talked about is, you asserted that perhaps it is the Israelis, right, who need to learn to mourn. And you talk about how the Palestinians, you talk of how for the Israelis constitute the Palestinians as this kind of like biblical monster. You use a term that I'm not a biblical scholar, but Amalekites, is that what it is?
Well,
Yeah.
Netanyahu used it, no? He
Yeah.
described the
Well,
war
right.
in Gaza with the Amalekites, yeah. So he used it as a metaphor of what the war would mean, which means total destruction of the Amalekites. Like that's the biblical like connotation there. It's a total
Right.
like destruction of their women, children, sons, daughters, cattle, etc.
Yeah, and so the other thing you're talking about in this section is how the horrors of the Holocaust are projected onto the Palestinians, despite the fact that, Israelis came to Palestine, right? It is not it is not Palestinians who sought out yeah. And you mentioned it's Palestinians who must be sacrificed whenever Israelis feel vulnerable. And I think that I did think about 9/11 with regards to this. I mean, 9/11 is one of the things I hate to bring in because it's like I don't think that there's any real parallels to the actual actions of 9/11, but I do think there's a parallel in the response of the colonial or the imperialist entity to this feeling of vulnerability, that for their vulnerability they must sacrifice hundreds of thousands or millions, like that you just have to lash out and destroy swaths of humanity as the way that you deal with your vulnerability. And so yeah, I don't think those are equivalent, but I see resonances there. But part of what you lay out in your piece is you talk about the ironic tragedy that it is Palestinians who now will be telling how their entire bloodlines were wiped out in much the same way that Holocaust survivors do. And this, by the way, is something that I've heard from a number of anti-Zionist Jewish comrades and friends of how, I mean, this is something that they articulate quite clearly of how, devastating and frustrating and enraging it is to see, to have lived through the experience of losing, say, their whole grandfather's family or something like this, and then now seeing Palestinians describing this very thing happening, and it being used, the Holocaust then being used as a thing to sort of support the doing of that kind of genocidal response. So talk about how you see kind of how the resistance, you talk about how the resistance is trying to produce both the temporal and spatial capacity of Palestinians to mourn and the capacity for Israelis to mourn. So say a little bit about that in relation to what I just laid out. I realize that was long and convoluted, folks.
No, it was good. I mean, I think look, um, sometimes when you write a piece, I mean, you touch about, when you're writing something, there's a lot of things that you start like, words start falling from you, like in many ways. And I think what I'm trying to like hint at is that, and this is, I think, also part of like, Fanonian understanding of like revolutionary violence in the context of colonialism, is that this moment of violence is a moment that ruptures, the colonized sense of, of being degraded, dehumanized, etc., of having this kind of like dependency complex, if you want, on the colonizer. It ruptures because what it reminds him of, this moment of violence. I mean, even if it's not like killings, like I remember in 2 years ago when this whole, May 2021 Palestine-wide protest erupted. People were laughing at Israeli soldiers being pushed on the stairs, for instance, of Al-Aqsa Mosque, or that moment of satisfaction of seeing those that hold the symbol of power, becoming human, vulnerable, bleeding, being laughed at. Young kids were going to the soldiers and kicking them and slapping them in like their necks and just running away. So there was all these TikTok videos around that, like, even if it wasn't just, it wasn't necessarily bloody violence in a sense of killing somebody, but it was that moment where you can like touch your colonizer and see his pain and perhaps laugh at him or ridicule him. And so for Fanon, that was central to why violence kind of is a psychological necessity within colonialism. But also it had another side of the equation. It also reminded the colonizer himself that he's also human. So like for that moment of violence, both sides are human. He's human in a sense for the colonized, that he could be defeated, and for the colonizer it reminds him of the limits of his power, the limits of his invincibility, his actual precarity, his actual vulnerability. And of course he built this wonderful system of power, walls, and AI systems in the case of Palestine. And today I think I saw an article on 972 magazine, it's an Israeli magazine, that talks about how the AI system in the Israeli military helps build the targets in Gaza, and which house to bomb and which family to kill, and that everything is known beforehand through the system, in sense of like how many people live there, and that targeting is intentional. There's no non-intentional targeting in the case of Israel, in the Israel's military. So it chooses and picks what massacre it will conduct. I'm not sure if this is an accurate description, but at least what I'm trying to like at least point out is that you have this wonderful wall that surrounds you and make you feel that you're powerful, invincible, and only violence, only that moment, whether it's a slap on the face or a slap on your neck or being pushed down the stairs, reminds you that you're human, reminds you that you're also vulnerable and precarious, and perhaps that the only way to liberate both the colonized and the colonizer from himself is through this kind of resistance, inflicting this form of mourning on the other, to remind the other. It's not necessarily, in a sense, it's not necessarily that resistance is a genocidal, it has a genocidal intent, that it just wants to kill every colonizer. Like it's an attempt to also remind ourselves that we can defeat this colonizer, but also remind the colonizer himself or herself that they're also vulnerable and precarious, because perhaps for a moment they thought themselves invincible. So I think that is part of the dynamic of how resistance interplays, with mourning and with the ability to grieve the anemic other, this other that has this power over you and hold over you. And I think with Israel, it's an interesting case, whether psychoanalytically, whether it's in terms of the materiality of its army, whether it's the history again of what you just mentioned, also of vulnerability in Europe for the Jewish people, is that it has a very particular relationship to vulnerability. It has a very particular relationship. It doesn't mean it's not shared by other people, but it has a very particular relationship. Even a lot of like Jews who have some connection with Israel, even outside of Israel, or see themselves as Zionists, look at Israel as a an insurance policy, like as 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 a place that that is there if anything happens again in Europe or the States or other places in the world. So there's that kind of particular element of how also that kind of memory of vulnerability and also persistent anti-Semitism that exists across the globe, because it's not only historical, it still like exists, uh, uh, plays and feeds into this need for power and militarism, and how a lot of that sense of memory is also displayed either either cynically, I mean in an intentional way, or even somewhat subconsciously or unconsciously onto the Palestinians. I mean, in many ways, like sometimes I think that there's an Israeli settler group that has a Telegram group called the Nazis, and it picks up people like Ahid Tamimi, puts a target on her, and says that these are the Nazis, these are new Nazis. And it's a strange, I mean, it's a strange reversal of roles where you have the power, but yet the Palestinians are the Nazis, the ones with the power to erect the systematic kind of attempt at erasure of Jewish life in Europe, through this through the Holocaust itself. So I mean, and it displaces it onto us. Netanyahu was speaking about the connection between Amin Husseini and Hitler, and how Amin Husseini gave Hitler the idea for the Holocaust. I mean, it builds this kind of conspiratorial also theory around Palestinians. We're that powerful that we convinced Hitler to conduct the Holocaust, or that one Palestinian was the one that actually gave Hitler the idea. So there's always that attempt to kind of link Palestinians to what happened in Europe in the Second World War. And to us, it's it's an uncanny experience, because I think being the ones in an asymmetric power relationship where we have less power, it's weird to be accused of being that powerful, first of all. That's the part of element of even historically being that powerful, but also of kind of that gaze, that that use of this Jewish gaze on which we're kind of these also Semitic looking people, as Palestinians, are turned into like a SS agents, or Nazi prison guards or Holocaust guards, in the past, and where you can enact your vengeance every time you feel again vulnerable on Palestinian bodies, and as if you're searching for that eternal vengeance, on our bodies, and on a crime that Palestinians have not committed at all. I mean, in fact, you're still comfortable meeting Germans and allying yourself with Germans and taking money from Germans and weapons, and even on that level of pure relationship with Germany, even after 1948, when Israel was constructed. I mean, immediately Israel went into this intimate relationship, if you want, with Germany, and Germany actually was part of the success of Israel's economy by the compensation money and a lot of the investments that it gave to Israel at that critical moment in its history when its economy was weak. So anyways, but that is for us, I think, eerie also to hear, and uncanny also to hear, I mean, in a lot of the Western discourses about Palestinian anti-Semitism, about Palestinian, I mean, this is not to say that in many ways the rupture in 1948 did not create, or did not also allow the space for some of the importation of anti-Semitism from Europe into the Arabic and Islamic culture. There is some sort of importation of anti-Semitic discourses, but I think that in many ways it's different, and I think it even touches upon when a lot of cameramen and women, when they come to Palestine and meet a Palestinian, and he starts speaking about the conflict, a lot of us use the word Yehudi, like Jewish, because I mean, people forget that the first encounter with Palestinians within this Ottoman tellus, where people were defined by their religion, like Christian, Muslim, Jewish, that the way we talk about Yehudi is not necessarily meant as a Jew in a European like context, but it just meant that that's how people before 1948 differentiated themselves as Muslim, Masihi, Yehudi, like, and that kind of persists, at least culturally speaking. Interchangeably, we use Zionist and Yehudi in many ways. So there is all these also lack of cultural nuance in trying to attempt to put the Palestinian and place them. I saw like a video for Owen Jones where he talks about how fighters were sadistic when they were killing people, talking about how they killed Jews, and there's here a missing point where you're trying to kind of like talk something about the European experiences and trying to place it even in how Palestinians or Arab culture, generally speaking, relates to these terms in a completely different manner in how these terms are related in Europe. So that displacement exists, and I think, and it's placed on our bodies, kind of in an eternal form of vengeance again. And it's strange because it builds us like lambs to be slaughtered and weak and feeble. There's always been a war in among the Zionist has launched of Palestinians to disarm Palestinians, to completely eradicate their ability to defend themselves. But at the same time, I mean, we're built up, in a strange way to be like universal enemies, powerful enemies. I mean, Husseini, giving the idea to Hitler, or things like that. So that's strange, and you can see it even, Jared, in like Fawda. No, have you watched Fawda? Or it's
No.
a Netflix show on an Israeli, undercover unit called it's an undercover. It's called the Arabized unit, or Musta'arivin, which means like Arabized unit. They speak Arabic. They dress like Arabs. Generally composed also by Israelis from Sephardic backgrounds or from Arab backgrounds, and they generally infiltrate protests, or it was a solution. It was a tactical solution. Their first conception, these units, to the fact that in many cases, when you wanted to arrest somebody from a refugee camp, because the refugee camps are dense, you can't reach there with your military vehicles without alerting everybody. And generally people used to run away and hide. So you had a problem with arresting them. So they turned disguise as a device and a technique in order to be able to surprise the person they want to assassinate or arrest. So so there's now a series in Netflix. It's a popular series called Fawda. And also in Fawda, the strange thing is that the Israeli army builds the resistance as almost equal to it in terms of its capacity, cunning, in terms of its, ability to inflict, horror and terror and, violence. So they're built as like equal symmetric powers, kind of like fighting. But at the same time, so it builds you up, it builds the enemy up before, of course, the unit always is successful and kills whoever wants to kill and arrests whoever it wants to arrest. So there's that duality in play where, at the one hand, a lot of the Zionist discourse, revolves around this kind of victimhood, around of Jewish history of vulnerability, around its persistence as well, and at the same time building up the Palestinian to be something that he's not, even in terms of his power. Even in terms of his actual power, sometimes in that discourse. So yeah, I mean, I was just pointing this out. I think we went on an off ramp, but it must happen at least one time.
Yeah. Um, so I want to talk a little bit about the prisoner exchanges, and I know that I haven't read your latest piece, which I'll put in the
Yeah.
chat for folks. But I noticed that just looking over it quickly, since you mentioned it to me this morning. I didn't. Apologies, folks. I didn't read it in advance, but you do talk about it a little bit in there too. So this is great. So, um, I mean, watching from my vantage point in the West, it's been really moving to watch a lot of the videos that have come out, the images, and I've talked to a lot of, comrades and friends, and I think they feel much the same. And you know, I it in one part, I'm someone who I've done a number of interviews and conversations and work with prisoners in the U.S. context and political prisoners in particular. Recently, we published an interview with Shaka Shakur, who's a new African political prisoner in the U.S. And um, there's a thing that comes out um, a lot of times from elders, and I think that it's because they have seen more advanced phases or more phases of the political prison support movement in the United States that are more successfully able to, in some cases, liberate other prisoners. I mean, Assata Shakur being probably the biggest example, or the most recognizable example. Um, and talking about how at this phase of where the political prisoner support movement and just kind of prisoner support movements are in the United States currently, that's really not something that people even can imagine in certain ways, and such that a lot of the political prisoners that do come out at this point, um, come out when they are basically ready to go or already on hospice care. They're basically terminal and they have maybe a few weeks to live, and so a judge says, okay, you can spend a few weeks with your family before you die. And this is recognized as a weakness, of the inability of folks to be able to put any kind of leverage, essentially, on the state in the United States to, you know, actually put pressure on them to release political prisoners on better terms than that, right? And so I give that context to just say, looking at these visuals, I understand the context is quite different, but they're really quite stunning looking at the visuals coming out of Palestine, looking at, the Al-Qassam militants or Islamic Jihad or Soraya al-Quds. Obviously, I mean, there's a certain level of spectacle and of, curation of these images and things like that. But uh, they're pretty just kind of amazing nonetheless. I mean, there seems to be so much respect in the images from the masses of people who are at these kind of rallies or exchanges. And even to the point where there's a lot of images of the Israeli detainees or detainees of other nationalities that are being released that seem quite genuine in their respect or their appreciation on some level of whether it's how they were treated or whether it's relationships that they built with folks when they were detained. I can't say, and I don't want to say this. I know people can take this any kind of way, and I don't want to try to paint that this is a cakewalk, or a tea party for the people who are held captive, by the resistance, or put some kind of idyllic lens on that process. But it's also very starkly contrasted by the stories and experiences that are shared by Palestinians who have been held in Israeli jails and prisons, and the things that they describe, the kind of horrors that they describe. And we also see this different treatment of those being received by the Palestinians, and part of it is what you're watching, right? I mean, if somebody's watching mainstream news, I watched a piece yesterday and they were talking to an Israeli woman who was worrying about her family that hadn't been released yet and stuff like that. So it depends on that. But nonetheless, like, one of the things that came to my mind in all of this is like the sort of overall loss of life that's also associated with this. And even as like prisoners are coming out, obviously prisoners are going in too, right? And so there's like this idea that we do have to kind of reconcile in some way. And I think your piece around mourning in some way and around this sort of horizon of loss and all of this does help, I think, us to think about it to some degree, because um, in order to liberate prisoners, right? Like, there does have to be loss. Like, there does have to be sacrifice. There has to be leverage. There has to be resistance. Um, and so, yeah, I don't know. Kind of maybe just say a little bit about what you're thinking about the significance of these prisoner swaps over the last few days and how you're thinking about them.
Well, look, I mean, critically speaking, they come in a moment where, because of the enormity of violence in the Gaza Strip and also in the West Bank, um, you know, it's creating a lot of mixed feelings, in many ways. Like, in a lot of people are elated that people are being released, specifically when this release is not because they ended their time according to the military court, or because after spending, I don't know, 2-3 years in administrative detention, they're released by the Israel itself. It's because in this in this instance, um, it's us who forced their release. Like, that is what people are celebrating, specifically children and women who are released into the West Bank or Gaza Strip, depending on where the origin of the prisoner is. So there's that mix of elation, a feeling of being empowered in this moment. It's always different to be released through the power of your own volition, or to be released by, the system itself, permitting you to go. So there's that kind of element to it. The second element is that because of the enormity of loss, people are also, like, shy and not necessarily completely outpouring their, joy for this. Like, it's a moment of pain mixed with joy, and they coexist and co-join together. That is part of, also, the current scene. The third element, of course, is that there's still that specter of the return of the war and its intensity. I mean, the war hasn't stopped really, specifically currently in the West Bank. We saw 2 children being killed only yesterday in Jenin. You know, so in many ways, that kind of, like, again, recurrence of loss, even as those prisoners were released, you know, the same amount or even larger number were, in prison. Like, so there's, like, kind of that element. Is just, it never ends. It never really finishes. So there's that element to it. But I think, to me, I think what is central here is that you see kind of like an organic burst. Palestinians are not very curated, like, not very performative. Um, and I think you see this through the whole month and a half. Whether it's talking about October 7th events and how Israel, through its military censorship system, through what it allows on the media or doesn't allow on the media, through, for instance, its experience with the first 2 elderly women that were released from Gaza, who spoke in a way that actually kind of posited themselves against the war, against what's happening in the Gaza. These 2 Israeli women, the older women, talking about how, they were treated finely, they were okay. Yes, they were scared, it was horrible, but at the same time, they were, like, speaking in a way that, again, completely, fractures this whole profane Palestinian fighter, a horrible terrorist that, are bent or killing and just, crazed and just want to, like, completely destroy, kill without any kind of, political notion. So after that, Israel decided to simply curate how these prisoners are released, in a sense that they go to the hospital, they meet their families, and now we only get like leaks from what their experience is, and these leaks are always self-serving in terms of Israeli propaganda and what is released to the world in the media. In a way, it picks and chooses what to release and what not to release. It doesn't offer you the raw, reaction of those who were kidnapped and then released by, the Palestinian fighters. It doesn't offer you that. On the total opposite, in Palestine, prisoners are received in open arms. You don't get a lot of curation. You get a lot of interviews with kids that don't know what to say, and they're doing a lot of mistakes on the media, or talking, or being asked a question, not knowing what to answer and not saying anything. So you got all these awkward moments, even if journalists asking these little kids or those prisoners released questions, and the prisoners are not necessarily capable of even articulating their experience, or just not saying anything, or just shying off, or just like, how was it? It was bad, and that's it. Or it was it's like these short. So you don't get this a lot of like that curated image of what's happening, because as if Palestinians have nothing to hide, to be to be true, to it. It's like they don't need this kind of pick and choose strategy to be able to be convincing, or to be they can be just raw. And maybe it tells us something else also on the other side. It's like it has to do with the power. I mean, even if we do curate, nobody will believe us, no? So that's why we have to put our victims in front of the TV in Gaza, the children dying, so people believe that we are dying, while Israelis get also to tell us what happened on October 7th without showing us what happened on October 7th. And when they show it only to journalists and people in high power and people they want to impact in terms of policy, etc. So like there's also that kind of asymmetry in terms of who are people willing to hear and listen and feel that they are speaking the truth, specifically when it comes to the mainstream media, etc. So there's all these elements going on in terms of the prisoners release. But I think there's also here, because the prisoners almost are all from the West Bank, almost, not all, but a lot of the prisoners are from the West Bank. Why? Because also in Gaza, imprisonment and the carceral system still worked, but it worked in places where Gazan leaving Gaza Strip, the very few Gazans that can leave the Gaza Strip, maybe caught on the borders, areas checkpoint, for instance, or so there's very few Palestinian prisoners from Gaza, except for the laborers that now and the fighters of the October 7th that remained and were kept alive and now are in prison. So there's very few Gaza prisoners, less so than the West Bank. The West Bank, part of the policy that exists here is the carceral system, is the ability of Israelis to enter Palestinian areas and arrest whoever they want. This freedom arrest that runs supreme, and that's why actually also most of the violence in the West Bank, whether it's the violence of killing, is also superseded with this violence of incarcerating people. So here the juxtaposition is that this is a moment where Gaza is releasing also West Bank Palestinians, and the Palestinian resistance and the factions you named, including Hamas and Islamic Jihad and the PFLP and others, are releasing those prisoners into the West Bank, although they're operating in Gaza Strip. And it's embarrassing the current PA. It's placing them in a very anxious position where people are gathering, and at least on Sunday, for instance, when people were released, there was no PA official presence. In Ramallah, for instance, there was no PA official presence, and people felt a sense of relief that none of the representatives of the PA were there. A sense of like we can be just ourselves. I wrote that in my piece, and we don't have to play nice and hide our anger, and look at them and like curse them quietly without being able to curse them in the open. Some people do that sometimes, but they could pay a heavy price for it. So in many ways there was that kind of relief and sense of relief, and I think the PA is kind of anxious, and that's why, after Sunday, when people were kind of left to themselves and you saw Palestinian, Hamas, and even a Hezbollah flag being raised, I mean, they decided the next day to bring their muscle, not their official representatives, their muscle into these um, places where you should receive the prisoners that being released, and to kind of like try to attempt to compensate for PA's absence with this muscle of intelligence services and people belonging to the loyalists to the PA, being there and leading the gathering and intimidating all those that are not in agreement, in accordance with it. So it shows you also something about the dynamics in the West Bank, where Gaza war is also impacting how people are speaking about the PA, how they view it, how also they're feeling this sense of power at this moment when it comes to the release of prisoners on our own volition. And I think what you pointed out, it's actually a very important element. Yes, I mean, look, Palestinian resistance is also capable of curation, of course, and it's capable of aesthetics, and specifically Hamas, to be honest, because part of Hamas's experience is including its very, very, a lot of them are engineers and people who are very into details, and everything is thought through. I mean, in terms of the exchange of prisoners and where they're released, when they're released, how they're videotaped, these are things that are thought through in many ways. I always tell my students, if you want to understand sometimes the difference between Fatah and Hamas, you only need to look at there's a yearly student debate in Birzeit University, and the student debate happens in the open in this courtyard, and these students battle each other, the representatives of the political movements. Our student movement is generally political, and it people don't vote on the agenda of what you're going to do to the students or what you're going to offer them services. They vote more on political loyalty and stuff like that. So they start this competition and debate. Generally speaking, Hamas, what it chooses in this court is to surround the court acoustically in a way. Whenever their representative is speaking, you can feel like everybody's with him, they're clapping because they surround all the angles, they've already thought about the acoustics and how responding to their debater would actually, echo throughout the courtyard. While Fatah people always stand behind the debater and shout and scream, and everybody, we're all there. And it tells you also a difference in terms of the experiences, in terms of how, if you want a Fatah subjectivity and Hamas subjectivity. So yeah, of course, I mean, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, but specifically Hamas has that kind of mentality in terms of detailing their all their actions, their media operations, whether it's the figure of Abu Ubaidah, whether it's the figure of exchange operations, whether the psychological warfare embodied also within them. However, that doesn't mean that the reactions of the Israelis were ingenuine. I think part of the reason that they're successful is that it also has some sort of credibility, that people can see it and they don't doubt that there's some sort of familiarity and affinity, at least built throughout these 50 days or so, between the Hamas fighters and the Palestinian fighters more broadly, and those who they captured. And it also goes to things like culturally speaking. I'll just give you one anecdote. I mean, even in my in the second Intifada, the Israeli army came to my neighbor's house and we were sitting in the courtyard. They came in, they were holding weapons, and I had this very beautiful Liberian neighbor who's very quiet, etc. And as Palestinians, when somebody comes to your house, the first reaction that you have to do is not only invite them but also make them something, no? So he always immediately goes into this mode of receiving a guest, although these are soldiers coming in. So he's asking the soldiers, do you want tea? And he's going to make the tea as if these soldiers are coming as guests. Although the soldiers came and like took my father then and took him actually, and took his son as well. I mean, so you know, he went to this mode of being guest. And I mean, Arab culture is known for receiving the guest, of like treating the stranger with this kind of generosity, because that's how we turn the stranger from kind of an unfamiliar object, or human, an unfamiliar face, to somebody who's familiar and intimate to us. Is like the moment, is the first knack that we have, is that if you have a guest, if somebody is a stranger, I mean, and anybody that came to Palestine experienced that form of generosity, is that, you know, you're always, you know, received with arms open, etc. And even in this case, and I'm sure of that, that's part of the cultural experience here, is that, you know, even if you took these people, you know, in force, it's still that cultural disposition of treating them as your guests will exist. I'm not saying they were guests. I mean, yeah, they were captured and they were forced to be there, and they're not, out of their own volition, not in any ways. But that kind of like cultural disposition exists in still treating them as guests, and treating them as guests. And I think that is part of why these videos also have kind of like some sort of credibility, despite their curation and everything that we just said. Yeah.
I think that makes total sense, and I just wanted to pull up a photo here. I mean, this was like a screen grab from a video that was released yesterday sometime, and like, I mean, you can see the eye contact right between the guy on the right and the smile. But the thing that I think is also kind of amazing about this picture is that everybody else in the image is smiling, it is, and you can, it's quite clear that this is not, like, you can tell when somebody's faking a smile because they feel like they have to, or because they feel like, um the person, whatever, there's still some leverage over them, or however people might think about it, right? That they would be afraid not to shake someone's hand, or give some formality, you know, as a defensive maneuver. I mean, everybody, I mean, maybe he said something funny, I don't know, right? But like the image is just so striking that way, and I think that's kind of an example of what we're talking about. And I think that piece that you bring up regarding, that understanding of hospitality, and, you know, yeah, I mean, it that makes sense, and obviously agree. And I do want people to understand, I'm not trying to in any way sort of, glorify what that experience is like in its totality, because I can't imagine, but um it is just quite stark. I mean, like I said, the discussions that you have from Palestinians about what it has been like to be within Israeli, jails and prisons and military barracks and things like this since October 7th. And, I mean, this is long standing, but even folks who have, been political prisoners, been prisoners in that context for a long time, have talked about how much worse things have been in that time frame. And yeah, anyway, it's just a striking contrast that way. Um, One of the things that somebody brought up in the chat is, um, this question too of how people feel about, the likelihood of rearrest of, of folks. I mean, obviously, this is part of the asymmetry here, is that, you know, Palestinian resistance can undertake this, all of this, all these strategy tactics, uh, you know, many lives are lost, secures the release of, um, some prisoners, and then of course Israel still has the power to rearrest folks. And how does that? I don't know. How does that? What's the discussion of that like? I mean, what do people think about that?
I mean, the discussion around that, it depends on people's political disposition, to be honest. I mean, look, it's again in the context that we live in. You know, resistance, we talked about resistance and hope. We talked about resistance and its affinity with, for instance, war and violence. We talked about a resistance and its affinity to melancholy and all these things, retaining the lost object. And but resistance also, in many ways, that moment when you resist, it you know, it's it's a damn if you do, damn if you don't type of context. I mean, I once read, I forgot the book. I think it's called, philosophy of, self-defense or something like that. And it talks about this technique of torture in France, in the 19th century, where somebody's placed in a cell, a big cell, and there's blades all around him, and then he's tied. He can't move except slightly, and then also there's like water and food placed in front of him in a place that he cannot reach. And if he wants to reach the food, he will have to cut himself in the blade. And this torture lasts, 4 days before the person actually kills himself. In many ways, what I was trying to point out is that for many people, resistance is represented, or for the Israeli apparatus, is that any moment, any reaction, any kind of counteraction is also a moment for itself to reassert its power. It's almost a moment for itself to remind you that it's still the boss. It's still like the powerful party. It still can kill, arrest, do whatever it has to do to remind you of that, to burn into your consciousness, no matter what movement of your body. If you try to grab the food, if you try to release yourself or do anything, that you'll still cut yourself with a blade, because it determines the cage. It determines. That's how the apparatus of power also for Israel operates. So in many ways, this is a long history. I mean, it's nothing new, in the sense of trying to turn any moment of resistance into a moment where Palestinians are reminded of also the cost of resistance, including frustrating the Palestinians from seeing in resistance any form of hope. So that includes things like post-mortem, holding of bodies of martyrs in, freezers. It includes, mutilation of these bodies in the freezers. Some people were placed in, in a standing or a sitting position in these freezers. So when they were released, they were also like sitting or standing in a way that they couldn't be buried. You had, the destruction of the home of the family. When we talk about, for instance, things like collective punishment, somebody does a resistance action, and then you go and destroy the family's house, or you build a settlement in the place of the Israeli who was killed in a certain area. You build, or you name the settlement for that person. So, or if you release prisoners, because you have to release prisoners, you go and arrest more people to make sure that Palestinians understand that you still have the power of arrest. Or if you do October 7th, then you go for the destruction of Gaza. So that you use this apparatus of power operates, it uses your moment of resistance to remind you of its power and to affirm itself. So it works in the same way that cage work. It makes you cut yourself, kind of, in a way. So there's a people that some Palestinians fall into this trap of feeling that resistance is devoid of any hope, that it only brings about destruction, it only brings about more killing, because of that association that the system builds in their minds and burns into their conscience. So some people, fall into this trap and become spokespeople for it. And some of the less necessarily, political of them, it's people that are also afraid for themselves, their lives, their family. It's a natural, if you want, knack to attempt to survive, even if survival means cooperation with your, master or with your colonizer. So there's that element to it that exists. The second element is that still there's a sense of pride. There's a sense of relief, a sense of being able to affirm yourself and force yourself onto this world by releasing the prisoners through your own volition and your own will. And I think that also comes across powerfully for most people in the West Bank and Gaza. And it plays a big role not only in building imaginaries of resistance or in producing resistance subjectivities. It also, plays an important role in feeling the power of what could be done, and reminding you that you're still alive, and that you're not completely, dead, and you're alive on your own terms, not on the terms of how the other wants to set up the structure and the game. So I think that is the second response, and I think it's the larger response at this moment, because we're talking about a specific event. It's small, it's women and children. It's only 300 Palestinian prisoners perhaps by the end of this. So it's still not registering as a significant big event, and because people are still anxious about the return of war to Gaza, it's still taking a mild form. But I think if Palestinian resistance successfully clears the prisons, even for a moment, even if for a moment, it will remind Palestinians that clearing the prisons is possible. And I think most Palestinians, because of the amount of destruction in Gaza and those who were martyred in Gaza and the enormity of loss, are not really understanding the enormity of the political success of clearing the prisons. And this is not to say, if you're going to calculate it in terms of numbers, oh, there's 6,000 Palestinian prisoners, and then you have, 20,000 Palestinians killed in Gaza, and was it worth it? That question is also raised. I don't think we can quantify it in that element, although it's an legitimate question that people can ask and posit. But I think what is central is that for a moment you liberated, you abolished, you completely eradicated any Palestinian body being in prison. For a moment, you can see a world without the carceral system, even if the next day they arrest 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 or 12. No, for a moment, those prison guards will not have a job to do. For a moment, the whole prison system will be demolished. And I think that is something has accompanied us through 50 years, and even before that through at least 75 years, and even before that with British colonialism for at least I don't know, 90 years or whatever of our existence, of being incarcerated, tortured, in prison, of building philosophies of steadfastness and not confessing, and struggling, and sides where we fail sometimes at not confessing, so we confess, and the breakdown of friendship, the breakdown of camaraderie ship in these sides of where you fail to affirm your political commitment and your friendship to the other. So these are sides that are also traumatic for a lot of Palestinians, traumatic for also creating that melancholic subjectivity that we talked about, the one that is invested in loss itself. A lot of Palestinians ask the question, how can a Palestinian security officer now torture Palestinians, when he was tortured by the Israelis and he was himself a political prisoner? I mean, part of the reason is that because in these sites, sometimes Palestinians fail to be steadfast and fail to not confess, and they break down. And these traumatic experiences, specifically for men more so perhaps than women, in terms of their machiness and their masculinity, etc., leads them to also invest in sustaining loss, because they cannot believe or see a way out of the system, because that will make them more anxious about what they committed in these sites. And that's part of actually a lot of the PA's current position towards Hamas and Islamic Jihad and those who are resisting, is that they think they'll do it better. Let's see. We tried in the 80s and 70s. It didn't work for us. So they're gonna feel like we failed. And they're looking with pleasure towards that failure, to reaffirm that their failure was the right thing. It was inevitable. It was predetermined faith, and that nothing else could have been done at that particular historical moment. And a lot of the people who speak on their behalf speak with this sensibility of how they analyze the current moment, not seeing, of course, the similarities, but also the differences in terms of the political organizations that we're talking about. So, I mean, I went into a long, conversation, I don't know, monologue, I guess. But what I was trying to say is that discussion about the efficacy, or let's say the utility of resistance. I mean, perhaps in a way, resistance is a necessity beyond utility. No, it's an immediate experience of freedom. It doesn't necessarily need a utilitarian notion. But even those questioning its utility, and I think this is where you can bring up somebody like Basil Araj, who was a Palestinian also fighter that was martyred in 2017, and he's a writer and intellectual, etc. And Basil, after reading so closely Palestinian history, I mean, he's an intellectual fighter. So after reading so closely Palestinian history of resistance, and organizing courses around it, and building a vocabulary around it, I mean, he came up with this notion that resistance always has a utility in time. المقاومة جدوى مستمرة. It has its own utility over time. It affirms itself. It opens, every resistant act opens the possibility of the act afterwards. Even in our language, when we say عملية is an operation, and an operation like a violent event or violent rupture. And عملية itself has this kind of like distinct of being a begin, has a beginning and an end. So there's that event that is that goes on the news. But عملية also in Arabic means process. It means operation, and it means process. It means an event and also a process in time. So actually every عملية opens the door for another عملية. So Basser read that Palestinian history through that continuation, and how resistance reaffirms and rebuilds and recreates itself intergenerationally, but also how it opens and always has some sort of utility. And historically speaking, and just to mention this quite fast, is that it proved itself even on a political level, in a sense that we wouldn't see Gaza without settlements, without resistance. We wouldn't see, for instance, even in the second Intifada, there was some checkpoints where some military operations happened at them and soldiers were killed. The next day we saw Israeli soldiers and army, or a week after, removing that checkpoint from existence. It never returned, because for Israelis, when they saw that that checkpoint didn't work and it failed and it wasn't secure, it vanished. And maybe they readjusted and built a checkpoint elsewhere, of course, but it vanished. In Jenin, in the second Intifada, when Palestinians resisted very intensely in the Jenin area, 4 settlements were deconstructed as part of Sharon's then disengagement plan that included Jenin and Gaza, the 2 hotbeds of resistance, whether it's in the West Bank or in the Gaza Strip. So you saw that utility even on a more political level. We see it in the release of prisoners today. You see it in a lot of different things in terms of the ability of preserving that capacity to resist and affirm yourself and identity and belonging without completely losing or self-effacing, or at least self-negating at some point, if you go down the road of simply only cooperation as an answer to the anxiety of survival under settler colonialism. And unfortunately, a lot of people, in Palestine as well, which is normal, choose that other road. I mean, I can understand it. It's a survival strategy. It's, it's part of people's, we all do it at the same time. When we go through the checkpoint, we behave like the soldier wants us to behave. I mean, we have to a lot of times cooperate under that kind of violent condition. But it's one thing to cooperate on that level. It's another thing to start doubting and deconstructing the meaning of any action of resistance through these kind of quantifiable, elements. That's what I wanted to say.
I think that's a great response. I mean, one time we were interviewing Sekou Odinga years ago, and folks, if you don't know Sekou Odinga, there was a fundraiser last night on Black Power Media, and he also has a GoFundMe. I'll try to pull that into the chat in a minute, but he's a storied Black liberation fighter. I mean, escaped capture multiple times. Also was an integral part of the liberation of Assata Shakur, right? And so I asked him this question, and even with like the question I just asked you, it's like I don't think this, and I don't want to ask it, but I want to hear your response, right? And so I wanted to hear your response, and I appreciate your response. And it's the same thing with Sekou. I asked him with the liberation of Assata, um, or maybe Josh did, one of us, and basically, was it worth it, right? Because ultimately he and others would end up incarcerated and charged with this, right? And it would cost them decades of their lives to get one person out and to have her live in exile in Cuba, right? And he just was like, freedom is worth everything you can give. And he said, yeah, I sacrificed 30 years of my life or whatever. He's like, I have comrades who sacrificed their lives, right? Like I didn't, my sacrifice is not as great as certain people's. And he also was very steadfast in this discussion of what we did was important because we demonstrated the capacity to resist. And even though the resistance may not be as prominent right now, it will be necessary again, right? And it's important for people to have these lineages of resistance, and I'm struck similarly, I mean, obviously contexts are different, and the amount of people involved and things like that in your context is greater, but those registers are very important, I think, to understand in terms of resistance, and not think about it just in terms of, yeah, if you try to quantify, that is actually in many ways how, it's always in an asymmetrical struggle, in an anti-colonial struggle, like the numbers are always going to be against you, right? If you get into a game of quantifying these things on those terms, then you would say, yeah, I mean, the resistance is not, it doesn't make sense if we're just going to look at this as some kind of mathematical equation of the kind of immediate responses to this resistance. It has to be something where you're thinking about the long trajectory of it, and you're still attached to, like you said before, of this, there's the melancholic response that sort of lets go of the possibility of Palestine, right? If you let go of that possibility, then yeah, it would be totally senseless. But if you still believe that these things operate on multiple registers to build a resistance capable of achieving that, then all of the actions have some utility to that. That doesn't mean you can't, think about them critically and analyze strategy and tactics and think about what would be the most effective and things like that. But it does mean that it doesn't operate under that simple logic of yeah, kind of a mathematical equation. The last thing, because somebody did ask a question, I was going to let you go, but Francis asked a question I wanted to get to. So Francis asked, talking about the power, and at this point we were talking about the power of the exchanges and kind of how that's resonating. And she felt like it's important in a special way for Palestinians in 48. For people who don't know, that's, I guess, what's generally called Israel, right? Do you have any comments on that dimension after response to October 7th and after Palestinians in 48?
I mean, Palestinians in 48 are, this is one of the things about Palestine. It's a very small geography, cut into a million pieces, with different experiences, and even under the same colonialism, different relationships to the state, to the colonial state, and different historical traumas as well, although they're similar and shared. So, the experience of Palestinians in 48, while similar to the rest of Palestinians, is profoundly different. In a way that, Palestinians in 48, were internal displaced or people who remained after the 48 Nakba. But these are the people that saw the world around them get destroyed, not the people that saw themselves outside of Palestine. as refugees. Some of them were refugees and returned. And there's a whole, different moment where, the element of survival that we're talking about through cooperation and then through citizenship as well became prominent even within the Palestinian leadership, within, you know, among Palestinians in 48. Like the notion that because we were, the people we remained, we were giving citizenship, and that our role in the Palestinian struggle is to just remain. So what that means is just it's a more passive posture. It's, there needs to be Palestinians remaining in Akka, in Yafa, in the villages of the Galilee, in the triangle area, what's called the triangle area, in the Naqab. And that's our, that's the main prominent role that we should play. Remaining. Now, the nature of that remaining is, could be different. And I don't want to talk about like, the Palestinian 48, just one historical experience or one form of articulation of resistance, because it's varied. A lot of them joined armed resistance. Mahmoud Darwish, for instance, is from 48, joined the PLO. There's a varied here responses. I'm not trying to say that it's a very different particularity. It's so radically different than others, because also in the West Bank, there are people that are willing to cooperate. And also in Gaza, people willing to cooperate. Also among, the leadership, etc. But cooperation and participation, the Knesset, for instance, and political participation has become part of that. Now, after the Gaza events of October 7th, and because they shattered kind of Israel's sense of invincibility, Israel's deep worry since 2021 was that, you have a war in Gaza and you have a war in Lebanon, a multi-front war, but you also have wide protests in the West Bank, but more prominently that you will have a lot of protests within Jerusalem and within 1948, places where the Israeli, if you want, civic space and the Palestinian space there kind of intermingle and are conjoined, and they cannot be easily separated. Places like Lid or Nazareth, or places like Akka or Haifa or other places. And there's also a logistical military element to all of this, is that if Palestinians from 48 go on the streets, they can cut the logistical lines that the army needs to move the tanks and move their weapons and armory, etc. And that could create a lot of big problems for the Israeli military in terms of its logistical operations in case of ground invasion, or in terms of moving, assets and power and military. So the very first moment of October 7th, we saw Israel clamping down heavily on any form of expression of solidarity or support to the Palestinian resistance, or to even Palestinian victimhood. So even if you don't post anything about Palestinian resistance, even if you just mention that there's a genocide in Gaza, or there's, a problem going on, that you shouldn't perhaps be killing children, even that form of discourse coming out from Palestinians in 48 was completely shut down. And this whole total fear engulfed Palestinian society in 48, because people were speaking about somebody just putting a like on a post as a reason for their arrest, or people expressing some sort of so there was like this move, this securitized police move to try and also kind of like control expressions even on social media, etc. So from the first instance, also threats were being spewed, since like things like if you protest, we're gonna allow the Israeli military to like shoot live fire at any protest that happens in any street. So there's all these rumors, all these laws being shifted and changed. A lot of also Palestinians that are generally in 48 that are not political activists. They're not the people that get arrested usually. Even people who are largely integrated in the Israeli economy, like doctors, nurses, like people that work in the high tech, were arrested. So it was to send a message, not only for the radical people shouting all the time in Haifa, or the people who actually go to the protests, because these are not really important. What is important now is for the whole society, its center, its gravity to be shut. So the Israeli police were arresting from also those who are economically from the Israeli, between quotes, middle class. They work in the hospitals, the pharmacies, high tech and other jobs that from this sector, creating a lot of fear among Palestinians in 48. So I think the reaction in 48 around what happened October 7th remained kind of like an intimate reaction in the dwellings of a lot of people's houses, in watching news, in watching the spectacle without necessarily being able to participate in things like boycotting Coca-Cola, or around that, without the ability to be vocal or voiceless, or to include your voice in a very affirmative manner. And again, this also has to do with this kind of like historical mentality, that if we now, for instance, in this moment where Israel declares this is my 9/11, this is the horrible attack since Holocaust, in this moment where Israel is going crazy and mad, if I now go and start protesting and create a bigger demonstrate, etc., that I'm hinging a lot on this, that this could backfire in our faces and lead to our remaining in Palestine 48 an issue. And Israel successfully weaponized that fear and used it to control what people say and what people don't say at that critical juncture, or since October 7th until this moment. I mean, I can't really express how much fear exists in 48. It's a strange element, because unlike, for example, Palestinians in the West Bank, where we have physical distance somewhat from the Israelis, or Gaza, which has extreme physical distance from Israelis. I mean, Palestinians in 48 work, they live, they're usually used by Israeli propaganda as this is the reason why we are not an apartheid state. Like, look, we have an Arab judge in the court, and we have the good Arab, the image of the good Arab that participates in Israeli life and society. So there's all of that going on as well. But there's a lot of fear. I mean, the critical mass of people and their feelings, of course, are with Gaza, and but they cannot express it, and they cannot bring it out to the open. So there's a lot of fear, shattering experience, kind of being torn. The necessity of maintaining this mode of remaining and producing kids and participating in Israeli life, but also it created a lot of its paradoxes historically, in terms of part of that, part of Palestinian 48 society also kind of accepted Israel as is, and it has to do with the education system. It has to do with how they're ideologically made to think that Israel is here as a settler state with Jewish supremacy is something that they should cherish living under, because it provides you with health care, or it provides you, this is the sort of thing that if a Palestinian from 48 objects to a certain like discriminatory policy, the Zionist response is immediate. If you don't like it, go to Syria, or go to Gaza, or go to like, if you don't like what you have here, we built the country and you're benefiting from this country, from these. So it's used against you to embezzle, and there's this ideological sensibility that is built. I'm going on an off ramp, but I think that it's very horrific what is happening in 48 in many ways. It's very horrific, because people have even lost the ability to like openly express any sort of their Palestinian, let's say, sensibility, their tie to the other Palestinians. And it's a shattering moment, being drawn between your day-to-day life within the Israeli civic space, between being a Palestinian, where you see Palestinians being massacred on TV, between working in the pharmacy with other Israelis and going home to see these forms of experiences. I can't explain how schizophrenic it is, I think, for a lot of the Palestinians in 48, and how painful it is. I think a lot of other voices blame Palestinians 48 for doing. I'm more understanding on that front, for that silence, even if courage is always assumes fear. but overcomes it, and hopefully that society also will find its courage at soon enough. Yeah.
Appreciated. Yeah, and Francis offered like a quick, I think, clarification here of I think she was also referring to a sense of pride though that they may have with what the resistance is doing, even if they can't,
Of course. Yeah, of
express it.
course.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, of course.
Um
I mean, that's what the
what was
women express mostly. I mean, part of the like Maisa Abdulhadi, she's an actress, or a lot of other people who were arrested because of the showing pride on the first day of October 7th. Like of course, there's a lot of pride, but it's spoken in whispers, not in and
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, right on. I mean, it's funny as you were talking about the go to Syria or go to Gaza thing. I mean, I was struck by whether that's a settler response or because this is something that we get in the United States too all the time of like,
Yeah.
oh, you don't like it, go to Cuba, go to North Korea, right? Like it's like go to the countries that are under siege from our country and see how you like it there. It's an interesting impulse that people have. Um, you know, yeah, that's an
If you
interesting one. I
criticize
don't know.
anything,
Yeah, I don't know if it's a white supremacist, like if it's the supremacist ideology there, or if it's like something about going to some place and stealing people's land that then you tell them to go somewhere else if they don't like it anymore. How you're running things, I don't know. Be interesting to hear conversations on that in a European context of whether they have that same kind of uh, reaction, but probably to immigrants and things like that, refugees. Um, well, thank you so much. I mean, it's been great to be in conversation again. I look forward to doing it again, and definitely, folks, check out this piece, which is very good. We talked about a lot of it. We didn't get into everything, so check that out. That's in the show notes, and then also on mondoweiss.net. Just yesterday is another piece that we touched on a little bit in this, but we didn't get fully into. So check that out as well. And yeah, thank you again for the conversation.
no, I'm happy to be with you, Jared. Thank you. Thanks.
It's wonderful. Yeah, thank you.